Welcome to part 3 pertaining to the Mackyard incident and fake qualifications at CN Rail. In this series, we're looking at a lot of wrongdoing, not only in my opinion on the part of CN Rail, but also at Transport Canada. There may be some of you who are wondering, why even cover the Mackyard incident of 2007? Well, the answer to that is because the safety actions taken in the Railway Investigation Report R07T0270 pertaining to the Mackyard incident of 2007, well, those safety actions taken resulted in the first attempt to overhaul frontline rail worker training programs. And what came out of that first attempt, in my opinion, was nothing more than a complete and total public scam. And we're going to get into that as we keep going through the Mackyard incident series here. But the other thing is that the safety actions taken and the Railway Safety Act Section 19 order that was given to the rail carriers to overhaul all those training programs, well, parts of that document which resulted from that Railway Safety Act Section 19 order, part of that was actually discussed in the Railway Investigation Report pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney years later. So it's kind of like, well, we were working on this. We didn't quite get to it, but we were working on it. And they try and use that in a document 6 years later. For a death that happened 6 years later, the document would come out 7 years later after the investigation into Jason's death. But in my opinion, folks, these issues very much continue to this day. And so you get a lot of safety actions taken in these reports, and we're going to be working on this, but there's no follow-up and there's no continued compliance audits. And until those are in place and the audits are done on a continual basis rather than just once, in 5 or 10 years, these issues are going to continue because leopards do not change their spots. And the fact that there were so many changes to frontline rail worker training programs, so many violations of so many laws, is clear evidence that leopards don't change their spots. They will do what they think they need to do in order to maximize shareholder wealth, even if that puts frontline rail workers and their lives in jeopardy, in my humble opinion. All right, if we look here on page 9 of the Railway Investigation Report pertaining to Mackyard and that incident in 2007, you can see here where it says that the foreman and other supervisory staff were aware that the helper was inexperienced. Also, through informal communications between staff, the foreman was aware that other yard operating personnel did not believe that the helper was sufficiently skilled to perform the full duties of a conductor. Clearly, people knew that there was fake qualifying, I think, going on in that rail yard, and other workers were obviously expressing their concerns with someone who was clearly not qualified to be operating and in control of a belt pack movement, especially one involving dangerous goods. And if you look at there was a little bit of information that I took out, and then a little further down you get this statement that they had 6 trains to build. This was again on page 9 of this same report. They had 6 trains to build that night. Nearly halfway through their shift, they had only completed 1 train. And it says here, when the helper took control of the train movement. So, yeah, he was qualified, fake qualified. But he took control of the train movement. He was not familiar with how locomotives were handling, nor how the makeup of the cars was affecting the train behavior. The helper did not have a copy of the cut list, so the work instructions. And then, obviously, the crew was still not keeping up with the workload to get these 6 trains put together that night. And I'm going to tell you something about that pressure to get all this work done in one shift when it is so unrealistic. And I'm going to give you a concrete example of that as it pertained to my child and the rail yard where my child worked. And this is a massive rail yard, again, where they could have 40 to 60 trains a day. There's hundreds of employees that work there. And when my child was going through belt pack training in that particular yard, they were being told by the train masters that, oh, you're supposed to, move 200 cars per shift at night, whatever. And basically, the most experienced guys who worked in that yard constantly said that they were about the only 2 who could actually achieve that goal. And my child, on one particular shift, was working not with one of these 2 guys, but with another qualified conductor. And my child, in my opinion, had also been fake qualified with 0 yard training prior to moving to this yard. But my child was told to, put all these rail cars together and pressure to move 200 a night at least to put trains together. Well, the yard where my child worked, even though it looks very flat, actually had an incline to it. And that yard had experienced several rollbacks. Employees, when an employee was actually killed in that rail yard during a belt pack movement, the investigation revealed that many employees reported, having been subject to rollbacks in that yard. Well, many is more than a couple or a few or some. So the point is, CN Rail absolutely knew it had a problem with rollbacks in that yard, and they did nothing. I'm sure with every report there were safety actions taken. They did nothing until a conductor was killed during a belt pack movement. And probably, maybe only because I was back then already investigating the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney and putting a lot of pressure on the folks at Transport Canada, Public Safety, Minister of Justice, all the way to the Prime Minister's office in Canada. The issues in the rail industry pertaining to safety were already being very well documented. But when my child had to do, putting all these trains together with belt pack and whatever, my child and this other conductor refused to kick rail cars uphill because of their fear of rollbacks in that yard. And when that happened, my child was still fairly new to that yard. When they refused to engage in what they perceived to be dangerous work, the statement that they received, a notice to appear in front of management with your union rep, and you have to give your side of the story. The notice to appear was not, entitled refusal to work in unsafe work conditions or Part 2, labor code violations, unsafe work environment, whatever. It wasn't that. Oh no, the notice had been labeled delay of assignment. We're just going to make it look like you're slow doing your job, and that's why you're facing potential demerits. We're not going to label this what it really was, a concern with rollbacks and the danger that rollbacks played in that yard in matters of safety of frontline rail workers. So they get a notice to appear entitled Delay of Assignment, and then the one more senior conductor, I think he ended up getting 25 demerits over that issue. My child was immediately laid off. Pretty well almost right away after that refusal to engage in kicking rail cars uphill due to the danger with rollbacks. And so here's the issue. With just the passage of time, if an issue is not addressed within 28 days by the union, whatever, and if both don't get demerits, the issue just kind of evaporates. So there's a lot of things that happens behind the scenes that are ways for them to hide serious safety concerns by frontline rail workers. And I complained about the whole demerit system, and I had documented this issue for Transport Canada when my child refused to engage in this, very serious issue of kicking rail cars uphill and being concerned over rollbacks. So that's all been documented. I documented that with Transport Canada. But anyway, I'm just saying, when you have this pressure all the time on frontline rail workers to go ahead and get all these trains done, even though it's unrealistic. And, the guys who worked in my child's rail yard had stated to my child that really nobody should be kicking rail cars uphill in that yard unless they had 5 years of experience. And that too I documented for Transport Canada quite a while ago. Those types of statements that were made to my child by others who had the best experience in that yard. Because, I would have to think that these people had to also be concerned with what was going on with the pressure to build all these trains when these people do not have the experience. There's no training pertaining to the topography, the weight of the train, the tonnage, the length of the trains that they're putting together, all of that stuff. There's nothing provided in training that had to do with that. And that absolutely impacts your belt pack movements. And whether or not your cars are going to roll back, whatever. So there are a lot of issues that, just saying, get swept under the carpet because of the way things are done in the rail industry in matters pertaining to demerits and notice to appear, which, your notice doesn't have the right wording at the top as far as a header and what the issue really is. We hide it under delay of assignment and things like that. And what's interesting, recently when CN and CP decided to go on strike in 2024, one of the things that came out was that there's all of these backlogs of all these notices to appear and whatever for the union. And the whole demerit system very recently, in the last month or two, seems to have been kind of scrapped. That CN decided to wipe the slate clean for pretty well everyone. Well, why are they doing that? Weren't those demerits earned? Why are you wiping everybody's slate clean? Is it just to clear a backlog? Or might it be to allows CN maybe to have an opportunity to destroy records. I'm not saying that's what it is. I just suspect that may be what it is. Why else would you be doing that? Honestly. And how fair is that to people who did lose their jobs because they had 60 demerits? One of the issues I raised was that, it very much appeared like management liked to have people teetering on the edge, that you were very close as far as the number of demerits you had to being fired. And that's another pressure that, a whole lot of people may have over 50 demerits. At 60, you can be fired. And, one demerit could cost you, one incident could be 25 demerits right there on the spot. And so a lot of people could be on the verge of being fired. And that's another way to put pressure on them. Make them play ball. Make them, do things that they probably should not be doing. So there's a lot of issues with the whole system of demerits. We sure as heck don't see management getting demerits. In my opinion, they shouldn't be getting demerits. They should be in a courtroom, a lot of them, for criminal negligence. But that's my opinion, based on my research and what I've come to learn of the rail industry. But anyway, so that's the issue with that as far as, again, you could see it back in 2007 here in the Mackyard incident, where you've got a lot of people complaining that, the assignments were too much and people can't keep up with the workloads. So that's a huge issue. Then, if you look at what was stated on page 10 here, and that's the block on the bottom, the CN General Operating Instructions, Section 6, governing belt pack operations, define a belt pack operator as an operating employee who, through training, experience, and knowledge, is qualified to perform switching operations and to provide engine movement signals using the belt pack technology. For a two-person pitch and catch operation, the controlling member has full control of the locomotive speed, direction, and braking function and can see the selected command in a small view screen. There's no actual speed indication. The belt pack only indicates desired speed. There is also no indication of acceleration, braking force, or required braking distance. Now, the reason I have a green arrow there, that the employee is defined as being, through training, experience, and knowledge, is qualified. Well, if you think about it, is qualified is very subjective, whereas has qualified is much less subjective, because for a person to have qualified and have qualified according to how they were supposed to be qualified, that would have been the 45 trips plus all of the other different sections in Table 1 pertaining to the training program. Well, if a person has qualified, that means they've gone through that entire program without any shortcuts, that you got the whole thing. Unlike this helper, who may have had as little as 22 of the 45 required trips, as we saw in previous videos. And if 60 trips were required to work in Mackyard, as may very well be the case according to the union contract, then that would mean this person would have had 37% of the required training and yet considered qualified? No. Fake qualified. Not qualified. Fake qualified, in my humble opinion. And so that's a thing you need to keep in mind. Is qualified, you ask a person, is this person qualified? Yeah, he's qualified. If you tell him, he tested, he passed his field test, whatever, people will assume that they went through and got all the appropriate training. A conductor trainee has multiple trainers. They work with tons and tons of other people, different people every day. And even though the training program was set up for one-on-one training, not one to multiple trainers, a different trainer basically every other day, that's not how it was supposed to work. But that's how CN Rail was making it work. Now, did they put that through Transport Canada for prior approval before field implementation? That, along with all these other changes to training programs that were including the observation trips as trial trips. No, you weren't supposed to be doing that. And if you did that without getting prior approval from Transport Canada, you did that in violation of the Railway Safety Act, Section 20. And so I'm just saying, folks, is qualified is very subjective. Has qualified in the rail industry means you've gone through the entire training program, passed your test, did all of your training, your observation trips, your training, your everything. And no shortcuts, no cutting of any of the aspects of that training. So that was clearly not the case with this helper who was considered qualified by CN Rail. So then on the bottom here it says, when one belt pack operator has control, the other operator cannot use the OCU to monitor the actions of the person in control. Either operator can place the train in emergency at any time. So yeah, you've got the ability to put the train in emergency. But a lot of times these people can't even see one another. They can't even see what's going on really with the train or the cars as they're getting closer and as the train's being put together. And so by the time they realize they got to throw something in emergency, it's probably very likely too late. And so you get incidents like the Mackyard incident of 2007, which was a movement, a section of rail cars that involved chlorine gas. Luckily, the 2 chlorine gas rail cars remained intact. But what if they hadn't? Mackyard is outside of Toronto, a major population center. What if you had leaked chlorine gas all over this population center? What did leak were several thousand liters of diesel. So huge issues when it comes to fake qualifications, unrealistic workloads, and the stress that is put on employees to hurry up and get this work done with minimal crews, and the pressure, the way that the demerit system was working, how we hide incidents, all of those issues. And they existed for years because my child was experiencing these issues. So CN may say, oh, we're going to work on it as soon as Transport Canada turns its back the next week. In my humble opinion, it's back to the old ways. That's just my opinion. I've just seen too much as far as railway investigation reports, and as I read them, and it's like, oh my gosh, here we go again, here we go again. And as we go through the first attempt here to overhaul those rail worker frontline training programs, you're going to see what a total public scam that was. That'll be later in this series of videos on Mackyard. But what's important here is that I would say confirmation of the fact that that was a total public scam is not only what was included in that, but the fact that it never went into force. Again, parts of that document were used in the death investigation report pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. Why are you including things that never went into effect in a death investigation report? Most people would never have been wiser to what was going on. All the scamming, all the lies, and the deception that was provided in the death investigation report. of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. And in order to really get all the pieces of the puzzle, you have to go back to the Mackyard incident and investigate that, because it was referred to in that report. Who's going to go and do that? Nobody. I spent 4 solid years of my life looking into issues pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. And when I say 4 solid years, I'm not talking 8-hour days. My days could be up to 16-hour days doing research and documenting. And so the issues were massive, but I knew there's no way I could help change the industry or help protect my child without understanding the issues and understanding and documenting them well. And so now Transport Canada, because pressure is being applied, not just in Canada, but in the US, as I now have brought these issues before 3 massive rail unions in the US, the Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, the Brotherhood for the Maintenance Away Guys, and Smart TD, which represents the conductors. Those 3 unions have now gotten enough documentation to know there are some serious issues that need to be addressed, especially since Canada allowed a lot of these players to escape, to infest no less than 5 Class 1 rail carriers in the US. And when you're now having a proposed merger between Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern, and the man that they would want at the head of that merged company is the current CEO of Union Pacific, Jim Vena. Jim Vena was Chief Operations Officer when conductor trainee Jason Clooney was killed in 2013. And all those violations of the Railway Safety Act, of labor codes, of the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation, all of those violations were under Jim Vena. And so until you, again, look at, and you have to go through a lot of reports and cover a lot of years worth of data in order to pick out all the different pieces of the puzzle and put them together for people to understand the issues. And so that's why there's a lot of videos, there's a lot of issues, but that's the only way you can properly address them, is to understand them and then have them addressed by putting appropriate pressure on regulators. And I don't mean just one-time pressure, a one-time audit, whatever. Audits, compliance audits in the rail industry, for sure, need to be happening on an ongoing basis. Every single rail worker who is new to the rail industry, there should be an audit to make sure every single rail worker is receiving proper training and the required training, not these, cut programs because we need to maximize shareholder wealth in the rail industry. Not good enough. These rail executives, in my opinion, belong in jail. Okay, so in a previous video, I had shown you the evaluation sheets for the helper who was involved in this derailment in Mackyard. And on page 13, again, you can see that he did not receive the minimum 45 training trips, not even close, may have been as little as 37% of the required training, depending on the provisions of the union contract. But anyway, definitely had less than 50% of the required training trips. So, but on page 13 here, I want you to also notice Macmillan Yard knowledge was not tested during training and qualification. Now look in the block here that I have in red with the red writing. Previously in this investigation report and in the previous videos, we also saw that Macmillan Yard has over 200 tracks. And even though it wasn't stated, if you've got 200 tracks, you very likely have hundreds of switches also to access all those different tracks, not to mention the sidings. So for a yard with over 200 tracks, there was no testing of yard knowledge during training or qualification. There were no maps included in the training materials. That to me is simply unbelievable. No maps were provided. There were no maps of the yard in the yard manual. Conductors were given little direction and were left to learn the layout of the yard as they worked on the job. Some conductors adapted by making their own hand-drawn sketches. Now, this is what you see on page 13 of this railway investigation report. On the left is the hand-drawn sketch from the helper as it pertains to what he views as Macmillan Yard. That's his sketch for a yard that has over 200 tracks. The sketch, or the map on the right, is what CN's diagram is just for the entrance to Macmillan Yard. Just the entrance. And look at how much more detailed and complicated it is. We're not getting into the 200 tracks yet. Now, in the rewrite of the Railway Employee Qualification Standards, which is going on as we speak in Canada, and folks, you need to keep a very close eye on that. Track workers are asking to be included in that regulation. Does not appear that the Minister of Transportation wants to do that, to have standard training programs for track workers. They need to be included. They are part and an integral part of rail safety. They maintain the hot boxes, the signals, the track itself, the switches, and on and on and on. So if they're begging for training and standard training, it needs to be provided to them. They need to be included in the regulation. But I seriously suspect, folks, that just as the safety actions taken and the Railway Safety Act Section 19 order that was provided as a result of the Mackyard incident of 2007, which launched the first attempt to rewrite the Railway Employee Qualification Standards regulation, and that resulted, in my opinion, in what was a complete and total public scam. I suspect what may be going on right now may be another one of those complete and total public scams. Only now under now Minister of Transportation, Chrystia Freeland, who used to be Deputy Prime Minister of Canada and Minister of Finance of Canada. Kind of seems like a demotion to be going to Minister of Transportation when you were Deputy Prime Minister, but I suspect the pressure is coming in from the U.S., especially with the UP-NS merger being proposed and all these players that have escaped to the U.S. Because how would you like to be a frontline rail worker in the U.S., knowing that many of the people running those companies probably belong not in boardrooms, but in courtrooms, and that the government of Canada didn't do its job in bringing accountability in these matters of so many violations of so many laws because Transport Canada decided to be not an oversight body, but a real partner in crime. And that is clear when you investigate matters pertaining to the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney. And then it opens up this whole can of worms that dates back all the way to Mackyard in 2007. So anyway, so you got this little sketch here that a rail worker who was fake qualified had to do for himself to try and familiarize himself with the yard, rather than CN providing proper maps to workers working this very large and clearly dangerous yard. That to me, I have no other words than criminal negligence, in my humble opinion. For stuff like that, you're not even providing maps. And, they may say that familiarization training isn't required for conductors, because if you look at the new rewrite and what now Minister of Transportation Freeland is proposing. In one of her tables, she's showing how it wasn't necessary for conductors to be familiar with the area where they worked. Well, maybe it wasn't part of the regulation, but it was definitely part of the Canadian Rail operating rules. And I suspect quite earlier than 2013. I have the 2013 version, but under General Rules, Section 10, it does state that rail workers are supposed to be familiar with the territory where they operate. And so that doesn't distinguish between conductors and locomotive engineers. The regulation known as the Railway Employee Qualification Standards Regulation makes it such that, yes, I believe the locomotive engineers there need to be familiar with the territory. But again, is CN really adhering to that? My opinion, no. And I'll tell you why. My own child, who's a locomotive engineer at CN Rail now, on more than one occasion has been asked to take a train to a completely new territory where they'd never been before. Really, what happened to familiarization being necessary for locomotive engineers? I always tell my child, push back and request a pilot locomotive engineer to familiarize yourself with the territory. Because I'll tell you something, folks, if you're a frontline rail worker, especially locomotive engineers, and you take a train in unfamiliar territory where you've never been before and something happens, they'll have no problem with throwing you under the bus. Even though quite clearly CN Rail, or CP, if it was CP in Canada, if they do that and they force somebody to take trains where the locomotive engineer at the control has never been trained in that territory, well, again, who's more negligent? Management? Definitely. Because, you know, as former CEO Claude Mongeau at CN Rail, after the death of conductor trainee Jason Clooney, he was in front of the Metropolitan Montreal Board of Trade telling people who could be potential investors in CN Rail how CN had the best in the nation IT team. Well, I'm sorry. Why are your employees being called to take trains for areas or territories with which they have not been familiarized? And why isn't rail traffic control or the crew office, which calls these crews to work, or your systems not catching that and preventing that from happening? That's one of the most basic things you should be looking for, is proper and complete training of your crews and proper and complete familiarization for those crews. Because you could be going on several different lines in the territory where you're supposed to operate. Well, what if you only go on one or two of these lines and you never really go on these other ones, but then all of a sudden you're called to these other ones? Why isn't the system picking up that you were never properly familiarized with that territory? And why would you not be blocked from even being called for that train? Good question, CN Rail. Where's your answer? Because there is none. This is going on to this day, because this happened to my child, again, not that long ago, just a few months ago, and we are now in 2025. So, huge issues when it comes to knowledge and familiarization for frontline rail workers. But this issue of no maps, I'm sorry, but how exactly is a locomotive engineer operating in Mac Yard, moving a train, supposed to be familiar with the yard if they don't have maps? How exactly was that happening? And the law required that they be familiar with the territory over which they operate. Again, good question, CN Rail. Where's your answer? That's what I'd like to know. In my opinion, there is zero excuse for not providing proper maps for frontline rail workers. You know, later on here in this paragraph, it says, this is in contrast to mainline operations where crews are provided with timetables, illustrated train handling guides, and track diagrams. Okay, well, on the main line, that's a pretty simple thing to draw out. And crews become familiar with the main line a lot faster than they would in a yard like Mac Yard. So, okay, we'll do the easy stuff. We'll provide them the main line track stuff, but we don't provide them yard maps? The insanity of this is beyond belief. I'm sorry, insanity is just one word. In my humble opinions, criminal negligence. How many people have been injured in Mac Yard when there were no maps provided, no familiarization provided to frontline rail workers? How many? How many were injured and how many were killed? That's what I'd like to know. How many dangerous good incidents happened? When my child says, you know, a lot of times the switches are not properly labeled, as was clearly the case for conductor trainee Jason Clooney, when you've got crews referring to track switch 23, not as track switch 23, but which is what the physical switch was labeled, but as track switch 15. So it's not even a matter of not providing maps, but it does appear that maybe what is provided might be seriously out of date. Huge issues. And again, in my opinion, criminal negligence. No other word for it. As we consider the Mac Yard incident and the fact that people were not being provided with maps when they worked in Mac Yard, not just the new helpers, there were no maps in the manual, nothing for that yard basically. And so you have to wonder, whose operational excellence was that? Well, we do know that John Orr was at Mac Yard in 2005 and 2006, per what we saw in a previous video with this particular slide from comparably.com, which looks at executives from different companies and whatever, and this was their information on John Orr, showing that he was the assistant general manager. That's the lines at the very bottom there that are underlying the very last two arrows. He was the assistant general manager for Mac Yard in 2005 and was made the general manager in 2006. Then it just says that he basically went to Edmonton in 2007, but it does not provide the date that he left Mac Yard. Was it before this guy was, the helper was fake qualified, or after? So the operational excellence of providing no maps to frontline rail workers in Mac Yard would absolutely have been happening under John Orr, as would be the operational excellence, which we will be discussing in part 4. Now, if you recall, it was John. See, again, I don't know when John Orr left Mac Yard exactly in 2007, but there was an audit of operations done in 2005 and 2006, and we're going to be discussing some of those issues in part 4, and that would have been under John Orr. Now, John Orr became Chief Operations Officer at Norfolk Southern March 20th of 2024. And so, you know, if this is the kind of operational excellence we can expect from John Orr, again, is that the kind of operational excellence we want infesting the U.S. rail industry? As a U.S. citizen, I would have to think, my opinion would be no. But that's just me. Prior to that, John Orr worked at CPKC and Kansas City Southern, as well as CN Rail in various roles. He spent decades, literally, in the rail industry, providing that operational excellence. So this is going to end part 3 of the backyard incident pertaining to fake qualifications and a whole lot more at CN Rail. And I will see you in part 4. So have a great day.